Don't touch them. The words left my mouth before I could think, low and steady, but loud enough to cut through the tension in the room. And for a split second, everything went still, like the air itself was holding its breath, my fingers tightening gently around Leo's small shoulder as Ethan clung to my sleeve, both of them trembling in a way that didn't match the calm luxury of the marble floors and glass walls around us. Because something was wrong. Something I had felt the moment I saw that black SUV idling too long outside the gate, engine running, windows too dark, like it was watching us, waiting, and I had moved without asking permission, without explaining, just instinct, pulling the boys away from the window, away from the open view, away from whatever might have been coming. But to Victoria Hale, stepping into the room in heels that clicked like judgment, it looked like something else entirely, like I had crossed a line I wasn't supposed to even see. Her voice sharp, controlled, the kind that didn't need to be loud to make people shrink. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" And I opened my mouth to answer, to explain, to say it wasn't what she thought, that I was just trying to keep them safe. But the words didn't come out fast enough. They never do. Not when you're standing in someone else's world, wearing someone else's uniform, holding someone else's children. And then it happened. Quick and unexpected, the sound sharper than the sting, echoing off the high ceilings like something breaking, and I didn't move, didn't react. Not the way she probably expected, because my first instinct wasn't anger, it was to make sure the boys were still behind me, still okay, still untouched by whatever this moment was becoming. Ethan's grip tightening, Leo pressing closer into my side, and I could feel their fear more than my own, could hear their breathing, uneven, too fast, like they understood something adults were pretending not to see. I was protecting them, I said finally, my voice quieter now, but steadier than I felt. And she let out a short laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, dismissive, cold, like I had just told a joke no one found funny. Protecting them? From what? Yourself? And I shook my head slightly, glancing toward the window just for a second, just enough to confirm that the SUV was gone now, vanished like it had never been there, which somehow made it worse, because things don't just disappear unless they were never meant to be seen in the first place. And my stomach tightened as that realization settled in, slow and heavy, like something I couldn't undo, something I had already stepped into without realizing it. And behind me, Ethan whispered my name, barely audible, like he was asking a question he didn't know how to form, and I squeezed his hand gently, grounding both of us in the same quiet promise that whatever this was, whatever I had sensed, whatever I had just interrupted, I wouldn't let it reach them, not while I was here, not while they were within arm's reach, even if it meant standing in front of someone like Victoria Hale and taking whatever came next without stepping back, without looking away. Because some things you don't walk away from, not when two small boys are holding on to you like you're the only safe thing in the room. And maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was nothing, just a car, just a coincidence, just my past creeping into places it didn't belong. But the way the air felt now, heavier, quieter, like something had shifted just out of sight, told me I wasn't imagining it. And somewhere deep down, beneath the fear and the silence and the sting I refused to acknowledge, a single thought settled in, clear and unshakable. This wasn't over. I should have walked away when she laughed, should have lowered my eyes like everyone else in that room and pretended I had overstepped. But something in Ethan's grip kept me still, his small fingers clutching my sleeve like if he let go, something worse would happen. And Leo had gone quiet in that way children do when they sense tension they cannot understand, his cheek pressed against my arm, listening, waiting, and I realized this was not just about me anymore, not about pride or dignity or the sharp sting I refused to acknowledge. This was about what I had seen and what I could not unsee. They were standing outside the gate, I said, choosing each word carefully, slowly, like stepping across thin ice. A car that did not belong here. And Victoria's expression shifted. For half a second, just enough for me to notice, before the composure returned, polished and perfect. "You are overreacting," she replied, her tone colder now, more controlled. But there was something under it, something tight, like she did not like uncertainty any more than I did. Security handles everything. That is not your job. And maybe she was right. Maybe it was not my job. Maybe I was just the nanny, just the single mother who needed the paycheck, who should have stayed quiet and followed instructions. But instincts do not care about job descriptions. and neither does fear when it feels real. And I opened my mouth to respond when the front doors opened somewhere down the hall. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the air, like something important had entered without needing to announce itself, and every person in the room seemed to feel it at the same time. Conversation stopping mid-sentence, footsteps slowing, even Victoria's posture straightening slightly, like she was preparing for something she could not control, and I felt it too. That subtle change, the kind that makes your chest tighten without knowing why. And then I heard it, footsteps, measured, unhurried, each one deliberate against the polished floor, coming closer, and the boys reacted before I did. Ethan pulling back just enough to look toward the hallway. Leo turning his head slowly, like they already knew who it was, like this presence was something familiar to them, something that meant safety in a way I did not yet understand. And I followed their gaze, my breath catching as a man stepped into view, tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not need to prove anything because it already knew its own weight. His expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the room, not with curiosity, but with quiet authority, like he was not looking for answers. He was deciding what mattered, and when his gaze landed on the boys, something softened for the briefest moment, something human, before it shifted again, sharp and focused, moving past them, past everyone, until it stopped on me, and I felt it, that weight, not heavy but precise, like he was seeing more than what was in front of him, like he was putting pieces together I had not even realized were visible, and only then did his eyes move, slow and deliberate, to Victoria, taking in the distance between us, the tension in the room, the way I was still standing between the children and everything else. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, not angry, just controlled in a way that made everything else fade. "Explain," he said, a single word that carried more authority than anything I had ever heard. And in that moment, I understood something without being told. Whatever I had stepped into, whatever I had tried to protect them from, it was only the beginning. And this man, whoever he was at the center of it all. No one moved after that single word. Not even the air seemed willing to shift, and I realized this was the kind of silence that did not come from fear alone but from respect, the kind that had been learned, reinforced, repeated, and Victoria was the first to recover, her posture straightening as she turned toward him with a composed smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It is nothing serious," she said smoothly, her voice lighter now, controlled in a different way, like she was choosing each word with care. "Just a misunderstanding with the staff." And the word staff landed heavier than it should have, like a reminder of where I stood in this room. But his gaze did not leave her, not even for a second, and I noticed the way his expression did not change, did not soften, did not react the way most people would when given a simple explanation. Instead, he waited, and somehow that was worse, because it made her words feel incomplete before she even finished them. She overstepped. Victoria continued, a slight edge creeping into her tone. Handled the children without instruction, created unnecessary concern. And for a moment I thought that would be it, that her version would become the truth simply because she said it first, because she belonged here and I did not. But then he shifted his attention back to me, not sharply, not accusingly, just directly, and I felt it again, that precise focus, like he was asking a question without speaking it out loud, and I swallowed, aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every second stretching longer than it should. "There was a car," I said, my voice steady even if my hands were not. "Outside the gate, engine running, no clearance, no signal from security." And I could feel the weight of the room change again, subtle but real, like something unseen had just been acknowledged, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in calculation, like he was replaying something in his mind, connecting pieces that I could not see. "And you decided to act," he said, not a question, just a statement, and I nodded once, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I moved them away from the window," I added, glancing briefly at Ethan and Leo, who were watching him now with a kind of quiet familiarity that told me more than any explanation could, until I understood what was happening. And for a second nothing happened, no reaction, no immediate response, just that same measured stillness, until he finally looked at the boys, his expression shifting in a way so subtle I almost missed it, something softer, something protective, and then back to me again, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. But something close to it, because whatever he was deciding, he was not dismissing me, not ignoring what I had said, and that mattered more than I expected. Security footage, he said quietly. Not to me, not to Victoria, but to someone just outside the room, and a man in a dark suit stepped forward immediately, nodding once before disappearing without a word, and the efficiency of it made my pulse quicken. Because this was not a suggestion, not a possibility, this was action, immediate and unquestioned. And Victoria's composure faltered for the briefest moment, her eyes flickering toward the hallway where the man had gone, before returning to him. "That will not be necessary," she said quickly, too quickly, and this time he did react, just slightly, a shift in his gaze that made the temperature in the room drop in a way I could feel against my skin. "Everything is necessary," he replied, still calm, still controlled, but final in a way that left no room for argument. And in that moment I understood something else, something that settled deeper than the fear or the tension or the uncertainty. The truth here was not decided by who spoke first or who spoke loudest. It was decided by him, and for reasons I could not yet explain, he was choosing to listen. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel intentional, like nothing in this house happened by accident, and I became aware of everything at once. The quiet hum of the air conditioning, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house, the way Ethan's fingers were still wrapped around my sleeve, but no longer trembling, just holding on, waiting, trusting something I did not yet understand. And Leo had shifted closer to me, but his eyes stayed on the man across the room, steady now, calm in a way that did not match the tension around us, like his presence alone was enough to anchor them. And that realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant whatever danger I had sensed earlier, whatever instinct had pushed me to move, it was connected to him, to this world I had only stepped into weeks ago without knowing what stood behind it. And I should have been afraid, more afraid than I already was. But instead I felt something else, something quieter, sharper, like clarity, because, for the first time since this started, someone was not dismissing what I had seen, and that mattered more than anything. They stayed close to the gate. I added, my voice softer now, but steady, because silence here did not mean safety. It meant he was listening, longer than normal traffic would, like they were waiting for something. And his gaze did not leave me, not even for a second, as if every detail mattered, as if he was measuring not just my words but the way I said them, the certainty behind them. And I held that gaze without meaning to, without thinking, because something in it told me looking away would be a mistake, not out of fear but out of honesty. And then he nodded once, barely noticeable, but enough to shift something in the room, like a decision had been made that no one else had heard yet. And beside him, Victoria shifted again, her composure thinning just slightly at the edges, her arms crossing in a way that looked controlled but felt defensive. "This is unnecessary," she said again, quieter this time but firmer, as if repeating it might make it true. "You are taking the word of a nanny over established protocol." And there it was again, that word, nanny, like a boundary she needed to reinforce, like a line she refused to let blur. But he did not respond immediately, did not correct her or agree. He simply turned his head slightly as footsteps approached from the hallway. The man in the dark suit returning with the same quiet efficiency, stopping just short of entering fully, waiting for permission that never needed to be spoken. "Sir," he said, his voice low, controlled. There was a vehicle outside the east gate for approximately 6 minutes. No registered entry, no contact with security. It left 3 minutes ago, and the words landed with a weight that made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were closing in around the truth that had just been confirmed. And I felt Ethan's grip tighten again, not in fear this time, but in something closer to understanding. Like even he could sense that something important had just shifted. And Leo looked up at me briefly, his expression searching, before returning his attention to the man across the room, and I realized they were watching him the same way I was now, waiting for what came next, because everything in this moment pointed to him, to his reaction, to his decision, and he remained still for a second longer, absorbing the information, processing it in a way that felt precise and deliberate, before his gaze moved once more to Victoria, and there was no anger in it. No raised voice, no visible reaction, just something colder, clearer, like the absence of doubt. "You said it was nothing," he stated, calmly. And it was not a question, not an accusation, just a fact placed in the space between them. And for the first time since I had met her, Victoria did not respond immediately, her silence stretching just long enough to reveal what words could not cover. And in that silence, I understood something I had not before. This was not just about being right or wrong. This was about control, about who defined reality in this house. And for the first time, it was not her. Victoria's silence did not last long, but it lasted long enough to change everything. Because in a room like this, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness was something people like her could not afford to show. So when she finally spoke, her voice was sharper, more controlled than before, like she was forcing it back into place. "Was still handled incorrectly," she said, her chin lifting slightly, reclaiming what authority she could. Even if there was a vehicle, she had no right to act without clearance. And for a moment, I felt that familiar shift, the ground tilting back toward her version of things, because she was not wrong about the rules. I knew that. I had read them, memorized them, lived by them since the day I stepped into this house. But rules do not always account for instinct, and instinct had been the only thing that felt real when I saw that car. And I opened my mouth to speak again, to explain, to defend myself if I had to, but he moved first, not physically, not dramatically, just a slight turn of his head toward me that stopped everything else from existing. And I felt it immediately, that quiet command, not telling me to speak, not telling me to stay silent, just holding space for me to be heard. And it was such a small thing, so subtle, but it shifted something inside me in a way I was not prepared for, because no one had done that in a very long time. They were scared. I said, my voice softer now, not defensive, not trying to prove anything, just stating what mattered. I could feel it before I even saw the car. Something was off, and I was not going to wait for permission if it meant leaving them exposed. And I glanced down at Ethan and Leo as I spoke, because this was never about me, never about pride or position or being right. It was about them, and the moment I looked at them, I knew I would make the same choice again without hesitation, rules or not, consequences or not. And when I looked back up, his gaze had not changed, but there was something different in it now, something quieter, more certain, like he had already reached a conclusion and was simply letting the room catch up to it. And beside him, Victoria let out a small breath, almost a scoff, but not quite, like she was trying to dismiss what I had said without directly challenging it again, because the ground beneath her was no longer stable, and she knew it. "Fear is not a protocol," she replied, her tone cooler now, but less confident than before. And for a second I thought he might agree with her, that he might turn this into a lesson about structure and hierarchy and staying in your place, because that would have been easier, simpler, cleaner, but instead he took a step forward, just one, closing the distance between us slightly, and it was not threatening, not aggressive, just deliberate, like everything else about him. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, still measured, but there was something beneath it now, something that carried weight without needing to be raised. "Neither is negligence," he said, and the words settled into the room like something final, something that did not need to be explained further. And I saw it then, the exact moment Victoria understood that this was no longer her conversation to control, her expression tightening just enough to betray it before she masked it again. And I felt Ethan shift closer behind me, his small hand sliding into mine, not because he was afraid anymore, but because he knew, in the way children sometimes do, that something important had just been decided. And as I stood there, still between them and everything else, I realized that for the first time since I had walked into this house, I was not invisible, not dismissed, not just the nanny in the corner of someone else's world. And that realization settled in my chest with a quiet certainty. This was not just about what had happened outside the gate. This was about what happened next, and somehow, without planning it, without asking for it, I had just stepped into the middle of it. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something invisible had already shifted and everyone felt it even if no one said it out loud. And I became aware of how quiet everything had become, not empty quiet but controlled, like every sound was being measured before it was allowed to exist. And he turned slightly, not away from me, but enough to signal that the moment had moved forward, that decisions were no longer forming, they were being carried out. Increase. Surveillance on the east gate, he said calmly, his voice low but absolute. Full review of the last 24 hours. I want every vehicle logged, every gap accounted for. And the man in the suit nodded immediately, already stepping back, already moving, because hesitation did not belong here, and I felt it again. That strange mix of tension and clarity, like watching something operate at a level I had never been part of before, and for a second I forgot where I stood in all of it, forgot that I was just the nanny who had stepped out of line, until Victoria spoke again, her voice tighter now, controlled but no longer effortless. You are escalating this unnecessarily, she said, her arms still crossed, her posture rigid in a way that no longer felt confident. There is no confirmation of intent, no direct threat. And this time he did not look at her immediately, which somehow made it worse, because it meant she was no longer the center of his attention, no longer the one defining the conversation. And when he finally did turn his gaze back to her, it was slower, more deliberate, like he was choosing exactly how much of his attention she deserved. There was proximity without clearance, he replied, still calm, still measured. That is enough? And the simplicity of it settled into the room like something final, something that did not need to be argued. And for the first time, Victoria did not respond at all, her silence no longer strategic but forced, like she had run out of ways to reshape what was already decided. And I felt Ethan's fingers tighten slightly in mine again, not out of fear, but out of something else, something closer to relief. And Leo shifted closer to my side, his small shoulder brushing against my arm, grounding me in a way that reminded me why I was still standing here in the first place, why I had not stepped back or apologized or tried to disappear when I had the chance. And I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath this entire time. And when I looked up again, his gaze had returned to me, not sharp, not questioning, just steady, like he was seeing me clearly now, not as part of the staff, not as a problem to be addressed, but as someone who had made a choice. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence between us different from the rest of the room, quieter, more focused, like everything else had faded just enough to leave space for something else to take shape, something I could not quite name yet. And then he glanced down briefly at the boys, his expression shifting again in that subtle way I was starting to recognize, before returning to me. And when he spoke, his voice was just as controlled as before, but there was something new in it, something that carried weight in a different way. You saw it first, he said, not as a question but as acknowledgement, and I nodded once, because there was nothing else to say, no need to explain further. And for a moment it felt like the entire room was waiting for what came next, not just the staff, not just Victoria, but even the boys, even me, because whatever he said now would not just define what had happened, it would define what it meant. And I realized then, standing there with Ethan's hand in mine and Leo pressed quietly against my side, that this was the moment everything would turn, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. The way he said it did not sound like praise, and it was not meant to be, but it landed heavier than anything else in the room, because acknowledgement from someone like him did not come easily, and I felt it settle somewhere deep, quiet but undeniable. And for a moment I did not know what to do with it, because I was not used to being seen like that. Not here, not anywhere that mattered, and Ethan's fingers loosened slightly in mine, not letting go but no longer holding on out of fear, just staying, like he trusted the ground beneath him again. And Leo shifted his weight, leaning just a little closer into my side, calmer now, his breathing steady, and I realized the tension that had wrapped around them earlier had begun to fade, not because the situation was resolved, but because something had changed in the person standing in front of us, something they recognized instinctively. And he looked at them again, not for long, just enough to confirm what he needed to see, before his attention returned to me. And for a second it felt like the rest of the room did not exist, like everything else had stepped back, leaving only the space between us and the weight of what had just happened. You did not wait, he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying a different kind of weight now, something closer to meaning. And I shook my head slightly, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest. I could not, I replied, because there was no other answer that would have been true. And he held my gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring that response, as if deciding what it revealed about me. And then he nodded once, A small movement that should not have mattered as much as it did. But it did, because it felt like permission, not to act, not to speak, but to exist in this space without being dismissed. And behind him, Victoria shifted again, her presence no longer commanding the room the way it had before, her silence heavier now, edged with something I could not quite name, frustration, disbelief, maybe both, but she did not interrupt this time, did not try to redirect the moment back to where she had control, because she understood now that it was gone, and I became aware of the others in the room again, the staff standing just a little straighter, a little quieter, watching without appearing to watch, because everyone here knew how to read moments like this, knew how to recognize when something had shifted permanently. And he took another step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to narrow the distance, and I felt my breath catch slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because up close, everything about him was sharper, more defined, the control in his expression, the stillness in his posture, the way nothing about him was accidental. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough that it felt more personal, more direct. "You trusted your instinct over instruction," he said, and I nodded once, because there was no denying it, no softening it into something more acceptable. And for a moment I thought he might question that, might challenge it, might remind me of my place in a way that would reset everything back to what it was before. But instead he looked at the boys again, then back at me, and something in his expression shifted, not softer exactly, but clearer, like a decision had reached its final form. "Good," he said simply, and the word was quiet, almost understated, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it did not just acknowledge what I had done, it validated it, and I felt it immediately, that shift, that undeniable change in the air. And somewhere behind me, Ethan let out a breath he had been holding, and Leo's small hand brushed against my arm, steady and warm, and I understood then, in a way I had not before, that this moment was not just about being right. It was about being chosen, not in a way I expected, not in a way I could fully understand yet, but in a way that meant I was no longer just passing through this world unnoticed. And as I stood there, still between them and everything else, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think until now. This was not going to be temporary anymore. The word stayed in the air longer than it should have, simple and quiet and impossible to ignore, and I felt it settle into everything around us, into the stillness of the room, into the way the staff stood a little straighter, into the way Ethan's fingers finally relaxed in mine, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment without knowing it. And Leo shifted beside me, his small hand now resting lightly against my arm instead of clinging, and I realized they understood something I was only beginning to process, that whatever had just been decided was not temporary, not something that would fade once the moment passed. It was something that would stay, and I swallowed slowly, trying to ground myself in something familiar, something that made sense, but nothing about this did, not the way he had listened, not the way he had chosen to believe what I said without hesitation. Not the way the entire room had shifted around a single quiet word, and for a second I wondered if I had misread it, if I had imagined the weight behind it. But then he turned slightly, just enough to address the space behind him without looking away from me completely. "From this point forward," he said, his voice steady, controlled, carrying through the room without needing to rise, "her judgment stands when it concerns the boys." And the words landed differently than anything else he had said, because this was not just acknowledgement. This was authority, given and recognized in the same breath, and I felt it immediately, that shift, sharper this time, more defined, like a line had been drawn and I was standing on a side I had not been invited to before, and behind him, someone moved, a quiet adjustment, a subtle acknowledgement, because everyone in this house understood what that meant, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Because this was not something that happened to people like me, not to someone who had spent most of her life trying not to be noticed, trying to stay within lines that were never meant to include her, and I could feel Victoria's presence before I looked at her, that tension, sharp and controlled and no longer hidden, and when I finally did glance in her direction, her expression was composed, perfectly so, but there was something underneath it now, something colder. Something that did not accept what had just been said, even if it could not challenge it directly, and for a brief second our eyes met, and I saw it clearly, Not anger exactly, but something close to it, something restrained, like she was memorizing this moment in a way that meant it was not finished for her, not even close, and I turned back before that look could settle too deeply, because I did not want to carry it with me. Not right now. Not when something else was happening that mattered more, and he had not moved, not stepped back, not turned away, still standing there with that same quiet control that seemed to define everything around him. And when his gaze returned fully to me, there was no hesitation in it, no question, just certainty. And for the first time since I had walked into this house, I felt something shift inside me to match it, something steady, something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. And Ethan's voice broke the silence softly, almost hesitant. "Are we okay?" he asked, looking up at him instead of me, and I felt my chest tighten slightly at that, because it said everything about where they placed their trust, and he looked down at them then, fully this time, his expression changing in that subtle way that softened the edges without losing the control. "You are," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, and Leo nodded slightly as if that was enough, as if that answer settled everything that needed to be settled, and I felt it too, that quiet certainty spreading through the space, anchoring it, reshaping it. And as I stood there, still holding Ethan's hand, still feeling Leo's presence against my side, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. This was no longer just a job, no longer just a place I worked to get through the week. This was something else entirely, something that had just changed direction without warning, and whether I was ready for it or not, I was already part of it. It should have ended there, with a decision made, in the room slowly returning to whatever version of normal existed before I stepped out of line. But nothing about this felt finished, not the way the air still carried that quiet tension, not the way Victoria remained perfectly still across the room, like she was waiting for something that had not yet been said, and not the way he had not moved away, had not dismissed me, had not turned his attention back to whatever world he had come from, before walking into this one. And I realized then that moments like this did not close cleanly. They shifted, they unfolded into something else, and I felt it again, that subtle awareness that I was standing at the edge of something I did not fully understand yet. "You should not have been the first to notice it," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less for the room and more for the space between us, and I blinked slightly, caught off guard not by the words themselves, but by the direction of them, because they were not directed at me as a correction. They were directed at the situation, at the system around us, and I shook my head faintly, not disagreeing but acknowledging something unspoken. "But I replied, just as quietly, because there was no changing that now, no stepping back into what should have happened instead of what did, and for a second something in his expression shifted, not frustration exactly, but recognition, like he was accepting that reality, even if he did not approve of how it had come to be, and then he turned slightly, his focus expanding beyond just me again. "Review all internal response times," he instructed, his tone returning to that calm authority that moved people without effort. "I want to know where the delay occurred." And the man near the doorway nodded once, already moving again, already part of the rhythm that seemed to follow him wherever he went, and I felt that strange contrast settle deeper. The way something so controlled could exist alongside something so personal, the way decisions that affected entire systems could happen in the same breath as a quiet acknowledgement of one person standing in the wrong place at the right time. And I exhaled slowly, grounding myself again, because it would have been easy to get lost in that, easy to forget who I was in all of this. But then Ethan's hand shifted in mine, a small movement that brought everything back into focus, and I looked down at him, at both of them, and remembered exactly why I had acted in the first place, why none of this could be undone even if I wanted it to be. And when I looked back up, he was watching me again, not intensely, not in a way that demanded anything, just steadily, like he was still assessing something that had not fully settled yet. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence no longer heavy but deliberate, like it was part of the conversation instead of separate from it. And then he inclined his head slightly, a small gesture that felt more intentional than anything else he had done so. "Far, you stayed," he said, and I understood immediately that he was not talking about just this moment, not just the last few minutes. He was talking about the choice itself, the decision not to step back, not to defer, not to leave the boys exposed even when it would have been easier, safer, expected, and I felt something tighten in my chest at that, something I could not quite name, because it was not pride, not relief, something deeper, something quieter, and I nodded once, because there was no other answer that would have been true, and he held my gaze for a second longer before finally stepping back, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to signal that the moment had shifted again, that whatever needed to be said had been said. And the room seemed to breathe again with that movement, subtle but noticeable, like everything had been waiting for it. And I realized then, as the space around us slowly returned to motion, that this was how things changed here, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with quiet decisions that rewrote everything without announcing it. And as I stood there, still holding Ethan's hand, still feeling Leo's steady presence beside me, I understood something with a clarity I could not ignore. I had walked into this house as someone temporary, someone replaceable, someone who existed on the edges of a world that did not belong to her. But I was not standing on the edge anymore, and whatever came next, whatever this turned into, there was no going back to where I had been before.